This was day 700 of the Trump administration, and here is what we are dealing with and covering tonight. Put it this way, the usual order in our government is not in place tonight. The diligence that dictates the behavior of the White House in normal times is not in place. Here is a loose tally of where we are. The President of the United States under criminal investigation, his children facing possible legal jeopardy, is threatening to shut down the federal government tomorrow at midnight over funding for his border wall, which he described today as being more like steel slats. The U.S. Senate is being called back to Washington from their Christmas break for a vote on border wall funding that, as of now, will fail. The defense secretary announced his resignation today because he cannot go along with the president's policy, which includes a surprise pullout of U.S. forces from Syria that Trump posted on Twitter. And today's news that a pullout of half the U.S. forces in Afghanistan is under consideration. Defense Secretary Mattis, a four-star Marine general, was openly referred to as the human guardrail in this administration, the last adult in the room. Add to that this chart, the stock market just so far this week and headed for the worst December since the 1930s. Here is the New York Times headline tonight. Congress, the military, and the markets were all in upheaval on Thursday. They go on to explain to their readers the news is too much to fit in one story. We will try our best to get to all of it here tonight. We begin with the resignation letter of Defense Secretary Mattis. It reads in part, and we quote, "My views on treating allies with respect and also being clear-eyed about both malign actors and strategic competitors are strongly held and informed by over 4 decades of immersion in these issues. We must do everything possible to advance an international order that is most conducive to our security, prosperity, and values, and we are strengthened in this effort by the solidarity of our alliances. Because you have the right to have a Secretary of Defense whose views are better aligned with yours on these and other subjects, I believe it is right for me to step down from my position." The reaction from lawmakers. Well, the Majority Leader Mitch McConnell released an unusual statement on Mattis that reads in part, quote, "I am particularly distressed that he is resigning due to sharp differences with the president." Democratic Senator Mark Warner of Virginia wrote on Twitter tonight, "This is scary. Secretary Mattis has been an island of stability amidst the chaos of the Trump administration." And as we mentioned, a partial government shutdown is looming after Trump said he is not accepting a bill without his border wall funding attached to it. Most members of Congress were hopeful that Trump would sign a short-term funding bill the Senate passed on Wednesday. But this morning, Trump reportedly went into what the Washington Post is reporting as a tailspin over the bill with no wall funding after being urged by conservative media and the House Freedom Caucus to fight for his wall.
And I would argue it's not a punt. A punt actually helps improve the field advantage. This is a fumble, and we need to make sure that the president stays firm. And a lot of people are very nervous this morning about whether the president will cave or not.
I think that not funding the wall is going to go down as one of the worst things to have happened to this administration. Forget Mueller. The wall has to be built.
4 times we promised them that we would build the wall and put it on a spending bill, and now we're saying, oh no, we're going to kick it to February.
One person briefed on the conversation told NBC News that the Freedom Caucus chairman, Mark Meadows, Republican of North Carolina, spoke to Trump multiple times last night and then again this morning, and that Meadows' resistance to the short-term bill impacted the president's thinking. In a meeting at the White House today with House Republicans, including House Speaker Paul Ryan and Meadows, Trump said he would not sign any bill without money for the wall. After the meeting, a somber-looking Paul Ryan addressed the cameras as one of his last official acts as Speaker of the House.
The president informed us that he will not sign the bill that came over from the Senate last evening because of his legitimate concerns for border security.
So here's what happened. Just hours ago, House Republicans added $5 billion in border wall funding to the Senate bill and sent it back to the Senate, where it would need 60 votes and thus is considered dead on arrival. The Senate is set to reconvene at noon tomorrow. Earlier tonight, Democratic leaders Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer addressed this looming shutdown and the events of this day.
The president is doing everything that he can to shut the government down. You have to ask the question, why? Does he not believe in governance? Does he not care about the American people? Doesn't he know that the economy is uncertain? Hasn't he followed the stock market that he likes to brag about sometimes? There's something wrong with this picture.
President Trump is throwing a temper tantrum and creating the Trump shutdown of the government.
Phil Rucker of the Washington Post reports tonight this way, quote, Trump has been isolated in bunker mode in recent weeks as political and personal crises mount, according to interviews with 27 current and former White House officials. Let us bring in our leadoff panel on an eventful Thursday night. Phil Rucker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House bureau chief for The Washington Post. Andrea Mitchell, NBC News chief foreign affairs correspondent and the host of the noon hour Eastern Time on weekdays on this very network. And Jeremy Bash, former chief of staff at CIA and the Pentagon, former counsel to House Intel. And Jeremy, it is your past in national security that leads me to begin with you as someone who knows General Mattis and has worked with him. How bad did it have to get for him to do this? Second part of the question, where do you assess our risk right now?
Extremely bad, Brian, because Secretary Mattis has told confidants over the past several weeks that he was not going to quit out of fatigue or frustration. He would stand his ground unless the president asked him to do something that Secretary Mattis believed was manifestly not in the interests of American national security. And here comes the president ordering the Secretary of Defense to pull out of Syria, possibly to take down our troop levels in Afghanistan, to destroy the alliance structure that has kept us strong since World War II, and in essence, to cede a lot of territory and game to Iran and Russia in the Middle East. That was enough for Jim Mattis. He's gone. He's been pushed out, and President Trump has jumped a key guardrail. And, Brian, tonight I think he is driving American foreign policy into uncharted territory. And I think what's of concern tonight is that when adversaries see the United States in such chaos and such dysfunction, both domestically and internationally, that is a recipe for mischief by our adversaries.
Andrea, what is your further reporting on what got this bad that it led to his resignation?
I think it was precisely that the precipitous Syrian withdrawal over his objections. He tried to talk him out of it at the final meeting when he did resign, and also the plans being asked to draw down troops in Afghanistan, because Jim Mattis thought that he had persuaded the president time and time again since April, again in September, that the Syrian plan would not work, the withdrawal would not work. And this was abandoning the Syrian Kurds, abandoning them to whatever Erdogan would want to do to them. And this was really hatched and finalized in a phone call with Erdogan on Friday. First brought up at the G20 in Argentina about 3 weeks ago, and then again on Friday. So he was ignoring all of the advice of Mattis. And I have to tell you how extraordinary this is. I consulted with our historical guru, Michael Beschloss, ours collectively and yours in particular and mine, and this has never happened. A defense secretary, never in American history, has resigned in protest. There have been two historic references where a foreign policy advisor, Cy Vance, I covered that in 1979 against Jimmy Carter in protest, and William Jennings Bryan in 1915 against Woodrow Wilson for being too warlike. That, according to Mike Beschloss. So I remembered the Vance, but I thought someone must have resigned in protest from the national security team. But no one since then, think of it. And this letter, without any salutation, no thank you, no it's been a privilege. This was extraordinary. It was a tutorial. And it's very alarming to our NATO allies and other allies around the world. I was talking to one NATO minister, very concerned that this might happen just 24 hours ago.
You're so right that every resignation letter in official Washington contains that cursory sentence about what a privilege and an honor it's been to serve the president, fill in the blank. This letter conspicuously without that. Phil Rucker again tonight, spectacular reporting on your part, reporting that the president's in the midst of a tailspin. Tell our viewers who haven't read your work yet, the Rucker-Costa-Dossi trio, how bad it got in the West Wing, how bad it is tonight, and who's left?
Well, it's quite bad tonight, Brian, and we talk a lot on this program and others about the chaos in the West Wing, but this is really a new chapter that we seem to be entering. It's not just Trump critics who are alarmed, but some of Trump's own administration officials, past and present, and his political friends and allies. One former senior official I talked to tonight said there may be an intervention that is needed, and said that it is noteworthy that Mattis did not resign only over policy, but also over what this official termed the madness from the president. So there's a real sense of concern. And what you have inside the Oval Office with what the president's doing is just so much pressure mounting on him. He sees these legal cases mounting, the pressure mounting on him and his family and his children. He sees that Mueller is nearing the conclusion. That report could be out in a matter of weeks into the new year. He's got Democrats taking over the House of Representatives. He still is not comfortable yet with how to govern, how to be a president in a divided Washington where his party doesn't control both houses of Congress. And you have all of this, and he's trying to exercise his power. He's trying to silence the critics in his own base, the Ann Coulters, the Rush Limbaughs, who have been banging the drums all week about the wall. And he feels very boxed in and without a lot of options, and he's lashing out.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me, or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.